So we wanted to talk a little bit now about high tones, low tones, and nasal tones in the Navajo language. A high tone is indicated by a tonal mark over the letter, and a low tone or a normal tone is indicated by the absence of that mark over the letter. So here we have a endoscopic view of the vocal cords. Here you see the vocal cords here that lie just right here at the top of the trachea, and this is the larynx, or the voice box. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's involved in raising or lowering the pitch of your voice in order to create those high or low tones in the Navajo language. This in particular is what we're concerned about. This is the vocal fold, and by opening or widening the space between these two vocal folds, we create a low tone because we're allowing more air to pass through those vocal folds. So a low tone, these vocal folds would be as wide and as relaxed as possible. So and you have very relaxed, and these vocal folds are very wide open. Now, to create a very high tone, for example a falsetto, these vocal folds would almost be parallel to each other, and you would see only a very tight line here for air to pass through. It's kind of like if you've ever played with a balloon and you've let the air out and you wanted to make it squeal really high. You tighten it up, you tighten it together, and it squeals really high, and then you let it out, you let the balloon relax there, and it gets a little bit lower squeal, and then eventually if you let it relax completely, it just sounds like air blowing out of a balloon. But if you've ever, that's exactly how your vocal cords work. And so when you see a high mark over a letter in Navajo, high marks can occur over vowels, all vowels in the Navajo language, and also the consonant N. So, for example, past tense is n-eh, is actually without the nasal, but just for illustrative purposes. So you can create a high N versus a low N. And so you see, and you probably can hear in my voice, that in the high N, those vocal folds, or those vocal cords there, are a little bit closer together. They're tighter. So and then versus and so that is tight versus relaxed. And so that's how we get, for example, in the vowel E. In the vowel E, we can go or and so we're tightening those vocal folds there just a little bit to create a rise in pitch or a rise in tone in our voice. Now, we have different types of tones in the Navajo language. Sometimes we'll see two vowels together, and the first vowel will not have a high mark, and the second letter in that vowel will have a high mark. This is called a rising tone. And so we accomplish a rising tone by allowing our vocal folds, our vocal cords, to be relaxed in the beginning, and then we tighten them up as the sound progresses. So for example, E, and if it's a rising tone where we see the high mark over that second E, we would go E, and so our vocal cords are going from relaxed to tight. And that's how a rising tone is accomplished. Now, other times in the Navajo language, more commonly, we'll see the high mark over the first vowel, but no high mark grammatically over the second vowel. This is called a falling tone. So this is where we start with our vocal cords more constricted, those vocal folds here, more constricted, tightly closer together with a higher pitch, and then we let our vocal cords relax. So for example, again, E, we go E. And so notice in my tone of voice, my vocal cords were more constricted, and then I let them relax. This is called a falling tone. Now, a constant tone will be the case where there are high marks over both letters, and you simply allow your vocal cords to remain constricted throughout the entire sound of the vowel. So we've seen this a lot, and in fact the word for hello contains all high tones over the vowels, or high tonal marks over the vowels. So we go ya-at-eh, so it's all high. And so it changes a lot in a Navajo word. For example, the word for question, the only thing at the end that is high toned is the iggy. So sometimes we go from a low tone to a high tone in a word and back and forth. It takes a lot of practice to do so, but it's simple enough to get down once you practice and get the hang of it. So for example, the word for question is inda ida kidigi. So you notice there's more of a low tone, and then the high marks there at the end over the I, and then you have the G and the two high marks over the I's at the end, inda ida kidigi. So you just let that tone rise. Now, we often have a nasal hook underneath that looks like a small little C underneath a letter. That's called a nasal hook. And let's just talk a little bit about how we create that nasal sound. So again, let's go back to our vowel E. So we have, if we just say E like such, E, see, then we're letting all of the air come up through our trachea from our lungs, and we're allowing it to pass completely through our oral cavity. And so we get E, and that's the sound that makes. Now, what we want to do in creating a nasal tone is we want to let the air pass through our nasal cavity. And here's the nose here, and this is a full nasal cavity that sits above our oral cavity or our mouth. So to take that, we allow the air to pass up through, and we don't pass it very much through our mouth. In fact, the air ratio that flows through our nasal cavity actually becomes almost a 90% to a 10%. So we can imagine if we go you still do have some airflow coming out of the oral cavity, but notice when you hear my voice that I'm allowing the air to pass mostly through my nose. And a good way to practice this is to practice different words in English that sound very similar, but one is nasal, one is oralized. Anything that allows air, whenever you allow air to pass through your mouth, you are oralizing that vowel. Whenever you let the air pass through your nasal cavity, you are then nasalizing that vowel. For example, the difference between the word cob goes straight through the mouth. The airflow is directed through the mouth. Now think about the word comb. See, you can feel it in your nose, and you're allowing that air to come up from your lungs through your trachea, and about 90% of it is now coming through and out your nose. In fact, if you were to hum, you would get the same effect. So, whenever we close our lips and we hum, all of our air is being allowed to pass through our nasal cavity. And so when you see that nasal hook beneath the letter in the Navajo language, that's simply what it means is allowing that air. Just pretend almost like you're humming. Versus ha ha ha. It's simply where we allow the air to pass through, whether we allow it to pass through completely our oral cavity or through our nasal cavity. So hopefully this has helped out a little bit in sound production in the Navajo language. So please make sure you practice all of these things. Get used to these sounds in your mouth. A good thing to do is to listen to a native speaker reading Navajo and reading along with him and noticing how he pronounces and his rising and falling tones, his nasal versus his oralized vowels, and so on and so forth. One of the last things that we need to talk about in the Navajo language is the letter X. The letter X in the Navajo language simply means that whatever letters come before that X needs to be fully aspirated. Now when you aspirate something, what you're actually doing is you're actually forcing air from your diaphragm and pushing that air out through your mouth. So the word for evil, for example, is yadashonida. Do yadashonida. Do yadashonida. So you hear a little bit of that. And what you're actually doing in aspirating that is you're placing the back of your tongue there at your soft palate, and you're allowing it, and as you're aspirating it, you're placing your tongue back there, and then you're releasing it and pulling it back a little bit. But you're not involving your vocal cords. If you remember in our last lesson, we talked about the sound ra. Now ra. You notice there in that sound ra that your vocal cords are involved. With an X aspiration, your vocal cords and your tongue is in much of the same place. However, you're not vocalizing it. You're not involving your vocal cords to make any sound or vibration. So do yadaashoni da. So shoni. Do dilchoshi. Do dilchosi. Actually has an X. It's the sound for soda pop. Do dilchosi. There you hear the again. And that's simply like you're almost like hissing at somebody. If you feel your tongue there hitting the back of your tongue, hitting your soft palate, and you're really releasing it. So so you can actually start with your tongue hitting your back palate, which you can't force any air through that if your tongue is blocking it. You're just allowing a narrow space there with the back of your tongue touching your soft palate, and then you're letting your tongue relax, the back of your tongue relax back off of your soft palate, and then blowing that air completely through. So, do yadashonida. Do yadashonida. So it's simply a more forceful pushing of the air up from the diaphragm and completely aspirating. Aspirating as if you were coughing up something. So hopefully that helps out a little bit. And you'll see that where the letter X is. Anytime you see the letter X, simply practice that and let that air just be pushed forward from your diaphragm and completely aspirate the previous sounds. In other words, add an H to it. Hopefully this helps us to understand how to create some of these more difficult sounds in the Navajo language and some of the tonal and nasal qualities. Next time we'll take a look at actually beginning to combine these sounds and these letters into forming words. And we'll take a look at morphemes and other parts of language to help us understand how Navajo language is formed and grammatically how it works. Until next time, agone.